My name's Lara Bampfield, and I am doing a DPhil in Assyriology within Ames, and I'm from the outskirts of London. So I study a very small object called a cylinder seal. Now, a cylinder seal is commonly made of stone, but these stones could be kind of precious stones, but they also could be more common stones that we would find. And the cylinder seals I look at are specifically from the ancient Middle East. So we're talking ancient Near East here, Mesopotamia, and they have images on them as well as text, but they are exceedingly small. We're talking about the size of your thumb, and they range in size, but on average around the size of your thumb, and they are carved by ancient seal carvers in reverse, which is just something that is absolutely fascinating to me. And the seal itself would then be rolled across a piece of wet clay and could be a form of signature, or it could be used as a lock to lock something if they put some wet clay, let's say, over a jar, and they could put the seal rolled across the wet clay. And then if the seal was broken, they knew the jar had been opened. So they had multi-purpose objects, but they are very cool. And so I look at these objects and I specifically look at cylinder seals from the Old Babylonian and Kassite periods. So we're thinking 1894 BC all the way to 1155 BC. So these are very old objects. But I will also occasionally compare them from other areas within Mesopotamia as well and different periods. But for the most part, I focus on Old Babylonian Kassite. So that's pretty much the objects I study. And then my specific questions and the research I do lies in how I can use digital humanities to help me understand these objects. So I have helped create like a scanning device, like an optic scanner, that can create digital unwrappings. So think having a cylindrical object, you always want to see it kind of unwrapped as if it was a 2D object. So I've created a device with some colleagues who can, which can do this, and it can also create 3D models. But obviously, when we're using ancient objects, we've got to be very delicate with them. So this is a scanner specifically designed to make sure that the objects are never damaged. And then from the data I can collect from this scanner, I can look into different forms of machine learning and image annotation, object detection, and how we can use these different styles of digital humanities and technology applications to help us understand what is visually on these seals, as well as having a digital documentation for them going forwards that other people can use. All the work I do is very much open access. So I got into cylinder seals through my undergrad. So during my undergrad, I was out in the States in America at the University of Iowa, and I was doing one of the degrees I was doing out there was in art history, and I was focusing on the ancient world. And I took a class in art of the ancient Near East, and we get shown an array of objects. But a cylinder seal came on the screen in the class, and I was like, that's so interesting. And it's called the Adda seal. I specifically remember the seal, and it's an Akkadian period seal. And I just looked at it and I was like, how could someone thousands of years ago create something that's not just beautiful, but practical with such a high visualization? So in the idea that we today can easily recognize what is being displayed as a figure versus an animal versus a mountain, etc., etc. And these are so small. So it's an phenomenal feat the seal carvers managed to do. And obviously they carved it in reverse because the purpose of the seal was that it would be rolled out onto clay. So any of the images carved onto the seal would need to be in reverse so that when it was rolled, it would be the correct way to read. So that is just phenomenal. So back to the question, which was, how did I get into it? I saw this seal in the class and I just needed to know more. And I was completely hooked on this object. And we had a final paper for the class and I chose to write about the adder seal. And from there, I've just never looked back. It became to my final year and I just wasn't ready to stop finding out more about these objects, really. I think it was lucky timing. So I did a master's in ancient languages, specifically of the ancient Near East. So I studied cuneiform, which has two languages that stem from it, which are Akkadian and Sumerian, so that I could understand the text that was written on cylinder seals. And this has helped me really develop my knowledge of what they were used for and how they were understood within their society, even though I still have a plethora of questions about them. So yeah, that's how I pretty much got into them. And then I've now ended up at Oxford just doing a whole PhD on the subject. They just show me how much we have changed, but also how much as humans we have not changed. We are still so interested in trying to create an object that is both visually pleasing, but also practical. And to think that ancestors thousands of years ago still had that same desire to try and like disseminate the knowledge and but also have a practical purpose objects they were creating, and to find such creative ways to do this, it is just so interesting to me. And I guess they were the reason I fell in love with academia. So that's an important part for me of these objects, because I think when I was at university, I wasn't quite sure, or my bachelor's, sorry, I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to stay in academia. I didn't know if I wanted to go get a job and try the scary world beyond. But it was like an itch I couldn't get rid of. I just had to know more about them. And I think they completely opened a door to a new path for me. And it's kind of bizarre because they're such a small object and they were made so long ago, that you wouldn't expect them to have such a an influence on, I guess, a modern day scholar. The biggest debates are normally around chronology and what is being represented. So one thing to note about these objects is we have records on cuneiform tablets, which are normally dated or we can normally date them in some way, shape, or form, that cylinder seals were passed down through generations. So therefore, it's very difficult to say when a seal was created. And seals can also be recarved because they're stone. You could go in and you could like abrade this outside of the seal and then put a new design, but you don't have to take off the whole original design. You could just potentially take off one aspect of it. So it's very, very hard to date these objects and to place them within like a stylistic, but also a textual chronology. And I think a lot of scholars would love to be able to say, oh, this seal is from this time period. One of the things that I have to focus on when I'm doing my work is making sure I make it clear that I'm following an art historical chronology. So I'm looking at these objects' style and how the figures were carved and how the text was written to try and work out what periods they are from. But it's not set in stone at all, and it very much comes with a caveat when you're choosing which seal falls into which category. And so I would say that chronology is definitely one of the biggest debates. Also, what is being depicted is another big debate. So in terms of iconographic meaning of what is being shown, you want to be able to, I think a lot of people, a lot of scholars would love to be able to say with certainty what is being visually shown on the seal. But quite a lot of the time, it might be a bit of a reach. There aren't very many examples on cylinder seals where we have a piece in the text that tells us that on the seal there is a depiction of someone. And so we have to take everything with a pinch of salt. I would love to be able to try and find kind of a code, kind of crack a code to what is being shown on these seals. Yet it hasn't yet been found, and that's why I think machine learning could play a part, because it can help track patterns on such a large data set. As a human, you can only look at so many seals a day, whereas a machine can look at hundreds more. And so the more images we get, high quality images of seals we get, we can input them into machines, and they can see if they can track like minute differences across figures and patterns and styles. And I'm hoping that will help us understand a bit more about what is being shown on this seal. So the device is called a Cyan device, and it uses two different forms of light to shine onto the object. So if you imagine a base plate, we have a mount that holds the seal at one end, a camera at the other end of the device, and then at an angle to the camera and the seal mount, we have two different light sources. So these two different light sources shine two different styles of light. One is an LED light, the other is a structured light. And they shine onto the seal and create kind of sharp edges, or a more wholesome illumination. And then the camera will take photos of the seal as it rotates on its mount to create a snapshot of the seal in the round. So it's a form of photogrammetry that has been expanded upon. And the device is twinned with a software that is called the Cyan software. And the software can take the images taken by the camera, and it creates a cloud of all the images, like a mesh cloud of all the images. And then from the cloud, you can create a 3D model of the object. And that's how the basics of a 3D model would be produced. And then it also creates these unwrappings of the image. So the 2D flattening of the cylinder seal, so you can see it completely unwrapped without having to actually impress it onto clay. And that is what the Cyan device does. And then from this digital data, so from the digital unwrapping and from the 3D model, you can apply it to different forms of machine learning and use the data, because it's high quality images. So they're very high resolution. And we can then use different forms of machine learning. So we could use an object detector, for example, which is where I'm focusing on, but there's no other reasons you couldn't look at other forms of AI machine learning going forward in the future. They can also be used in image annotation. So this is where you manually initially go in and draw a bounding box, so kind of a square box or a circular box around different parts of the seal. And from these different boxes, you can give them a tag or a label and say, this is a figure, this is an animal, this is a pot, this is a piece of text, etc., etc. Tags, you can incorporate them into object detection and other areas. And that is when AI can really take off, because you've had the manual input originally to kind of kickstart the learning of machines. So having a object detector that can identify different aspects of the seal means you can look for shared patterns. So, for example, if we wanted to find a pot next to something called a bull staff, which we know is a common repetition among seals, we could ask the object detector to find all examples of this within the literature. But then we could also work out the placement of these objects on the cylinder seal. And this is a question I'm specifically interested in, is the placement of these objects, and see if there is kind of a common thread of where these objects are placed. And can that give us some insights into what else is being shown on the seal? So, for example, if we have a seated figure on the left, does that mean we always see a pot and a bull staff on the right? And I think asking these questions to the machine, where they can look for these patterns and they can also locate the placement on the objects, potentially slightly easier than the human eye can, we'll be able to kind of plot graphs of where the motifs appear and ask questions that we previously might not have been able to answer. So I have several questions that I guess I have been trying to work out over the last couple of years. And I think the most important are stylistic evolution, so identification of distinct phases and changes in artistic style, kind of symbolism and iconography. Can AI help in categorizing objects that we might have thought of as fringe objects, or we weren't 100% with our identification? Can clustering algorithms identify distinct artistic traditions associated with geographical areas? So kind of looking at regional variation of these styles. And then how kind of continuity and change across periods. So how these seals change from one period to the other. And can the different forms of machine learning help identify these changes? So I definitely think it will be a game changer going forward. And I think the questions we can start asking of the objects will change with all the data we collect. The connections that the objects could show could unlock some meanings we haven't or had potentially hoped to find. One of the things that we do know in Mesopotamia is that there was different workshops used to create these seals. So you can kind of track some workshops based on small variations in style. So my hope is that some of the connections found through using digital tools will not only reinforce these identification of these workshops, but also be able to tell us a bit more maybe about how the workshops will run. So if we can look at different connections or different patterns across the seals, especially spatially, we might be able to say, oh, this is almost a set piece. So we don't really know how someone chose about what was going to go on a cylinder seal, but if we can always say these two items occur together or they're always placed next to each other, it almost seems like it's a predetermined set. So someone, an ancient Mesopotamian, might have been able to come in and say, I would like this set on my cylinder seal, and I would like it to include these elements. And so it might be able to help us track kind of the choices made and how the placements and designs were chosen. And it also might give us insight into the texts and how the texts might relate to the objects on the seals, because quite a lot of the time the text does not reflect what is being shown. So it will be interesting to see if certain words or phrases constantly appear with certain motifs. So I think going forward, I can't exactly answer exactly what the results will be able to tell us in the future, but I very much think that the door will be opened to try and find out more, which is what everyone originally wants when they go into looking to research an object. They want to find out as much information as they can about said object. So the more information that they can gain, the easier it will be to make a conclusion about these initial questions of how, when, what was done with the object. So in the future, I would like to continue looking at cylinder seals, but I'm not, that has kind of a pun, doesn't have to be set in stone. I would like to stay in digital humanities of the ancient world. I think there is so much to be done with applying modern techniques to ancient objects, and I would like to stay in that sphere. That could involve a postdoc, that could involve becoming affiliated with a university, maybe as a professor, but it also could work going to a museum and working in the digitalization departments or the imaging departments, or just as a curator yourself, but with a focus on digital humanities. So I think there's a couple of avenues that you could go down if you want to stay in the digital sphere within the ancient world. There's not exactly, you have to stay within a university setting. So that's quite reassuring as someone who's trying to work out what they're doing next. But I definitely think I would like to stay and follow this journey of tech and ancient objects. It's such a juxtaposition, but it goes so well together. And I think I could find out some really, really interesting things. And let's be honest, it's kind of cool being able to play with these objects and then also play with all the tech and work out all the digital things you can do with them. So it's pretty fun. So that's a big part of why I'd like to stay into it. And at the end of the day, since working with computer scientists, software engineers, people I would probably have never had much reason to be in contact with if I had gone down a more traditional route in art history or archaeology, they pretty much have shown me that the uses of AI, machine learning, and digital tech is placed by humans. The more creative you are, the more options become available with tech. So if you are more narrow-minded, then the amount of things that you can do is very narrow. However, if you kind of just expect that anything can be done, you've just kind of got to work out a way to do it, then you can get some tech that can do it. You can brainstorm as a team and you can work out a way, even though it might not be obvious at first, to get this information out of these objects. And what I really like is the advancement of technology has meant we can create kind of a digital footprint of these objects. So the original objects themselves are safe and they're not going to be damaged. And I think that was some of the initial nervousness going into technology, is that people would damage these objects going forward and they wouldn't survive. But that's not the case at all. There has been adaptations to all this technology that we can record these objects digitally, but also, most important, safely. And so I very much would like to try and stay in the area. I don't know if it will always be in cylinder seals. I would quite like to stay in it a little bit longer, but I don't know how that would work as a job prospect going forwards. I might have to be slightly broader in the objects I look at. But I definitely think digitalization of ancient objects is where I would like to stay, and the uses of machine learning. I would say the first thing is we don't really know many answers. So kind of the answers you originally want to know when you come in, there aren't straightforward answers to them yet. But that is the whole reason to get involved in the subject matter originally. So I think, especially if you're studying cylinder seals, try and come in with as open a mind as possible. It's great if you have a passion for the object, like you find the object itself interesting and you want to look at them. But I think that goes for any form of object that you look at in the ancient world. If you don't have a passion for the object, and you don't you don't have to necessarily find them inspiring, but interesting, it's going to be very hard to look at thousands of them. So I recommend choosing an object that really kind of excites you. And every time you see one, you're going to be like, oh, this is a new one. I wonder how this one is different. So I think try find that in an object. In terms of digital humanities, I came in with very, very little experience. I had dabbled a little bit in photogrammetry during my undergraduate, but I was no expert whatsoever. So I have completely self-taught my way around code and applications and software. And if you find the right people who are software engineers and computer scientists, they are very helpful and very understanding. And even though it might be silly questions, they will be able to help you answer them. And they are normally very polite. So I don't think you should be put off by the idea of digital humanities just because you don't have a background in it. I am so glad that I went into it and I find it fascinating. I also think in the ancient world, you've got to think about job prospects at the end. If this is the area you want to stay in and you want to study ancient objects, you need to have a skill that people want. And whether that is you can read the languages and you can help translate objects, or whether that is a more technical skill, or maybe it is working with the objects, trying to find you can perfect and makes you kind of sellable at the end when you're looking for that next step, I think is really important. So for me, I chose the digital direction, and I know that will open up more doors for me than if I had just looked at the cylinder seals in a more traditional structure, because I can have transferable skills now to other objects. I will be able to say, oh, I'd like to focus on cylinder seals. But if they said, oh, we also want you to look at a vase, I can say, yeah, I can look at some vases too within a digital realm, even though I might have to learn as I go along. That's okay. Right now, I'm co-editing a volume that looks at digital unwrappings across different spherical objects. So I'm having to learn about Mayan vases, and I've never done any study on Mesoamerican civilizations. So that's something that's really fascinating. But the whole reason I got into it was because I had worked on a skill that could be transferable. So I would say any person who's coming into this realm, try and work out an object you're interested in, one, and two, a skill that can be transferable to more than just your current object of interest. The most difficult thing for me doing a DPhil is structure. I am doing a complete research DPhil. I don't have to attend classes if I do not want to. And as a result of that, it can be very easy to put things aside and do something else. I would say trying to set yourself goals is a very good way to overcome structural problems, and making sure you kind of set yourself mini goals. Your supervisors can be really helpful in this. Say, although I don't expect you to necessarily have to mark it when I give it to you, I'm going to try and give you a piece of work at the end of every month. And this kind of continuation of submission of work, or I'm going required kind of gives a bit more structure to your day. So I would say the most challenging thing for me was working out when to work when I had no structured time to work. So that was my biggest challenge, and it's taken me the 3 years of my DPhil to kind of crack that code. That for me, working in the morning is the way to go. Get up, start the day, straight start to work. Then I don't allow anything to come in, and then I can be a bit more flexible when it comes to late afternoon, early evening. Whereas before it was very tempting to start the morning very slowly, and then I found that everyone else was ready to do something in the afternoon, and that was slightly harder then to get the work done. So find out what works for you, and that might be a bit of trial and error. You can always ask other DPhils of how they have worked. I found that very helpful. So asking other people in Assyriology, it's like, how do you work? How do you structure your time? And quite a lot of them said similar things. They find the time of day that they're most productive and make sure they block that off for work. And then they also try and have some kind of class each term, because that kind of gets you into a working rhythm. Knowing you have to be somewhere, you have had to have done some form of a homework, kind of keeps you in that rhythm of study. I would say the best parts of the DPhil for me is getting to work with objects that are thousands of years old. They are so cool. So going to a museum and kind of feeling that I get to hold these objects that are invaluable, really, and get to look at them one-on-one with the object is just, it's just a great, so fun. Like, I love it. I could talk about them for hours, or any of the objects really. And I although I work specifically with cylinder seals, you get to interact with so many different objects within the museums themselves. And the museums are normally pretty good. The first couple of times you go in, they explain how to hold the objects and work with the objects. But after that, you are very much like really allowed to just look at them and spend time with them. And that is probably a massive highlight of my DPhil. I know that's rather subject specific. More generally, I think it's being around people who share a passion for working out questions and trying to find answers to things that aren't necessarily an obvious answer. You've got to do a bit of a deep dive. I would say a lot of the people I work with love a rabbit hole. They start in the morning with one idea, and then by the end of the day, they've gone completely in the opposite direction. And that's okay, because I think that's something to know, is that all the information you're reading and learning, all the rabbit holes you go down, they're just adding to your knowledge base. And it's so crazy how these different bits of knowledge can come back into play halfway through your DPhil or later on as you're speaking to someone else in a different discipline. So I would say that's really nice. The community is nice to be around people who are interested in a subject area that you are. Most of the people in Assyriology that I work with, they are not tech-based. They are all language-based. And so it's very nice to hear about the work they're doing. And I know they appreciate hearing about the digital humanities sides of the work I'm doing, because it gives them ideas about questions they could ask their work if they wanted to go down a digital sphere. And I can ask them questions about things they found out just by looking at texts and trying to translate tablets that haven't been translated before. So I think there's so many different things to be excited about doing a DPhil. And there are definitely so many different avenues you can go down within your DPhil. You could be as social as you want, or you can just focus on your research. There are people who do either option, and I don't think either of them feel that they have missed out on something as a result of the DPhil, because at the end of the day, you still come away with a PhD, which is a phenomenal achievement, and you get to do some pretty cool things along the way. I think what I do, all the stuff I'm doing is pretty cool, and I love talking about it. And I know when I speak to people who aren't doing a PhD, they're like, oh, that sounds so interesting. That sounds so much more fun than the work I do day to day. Probably to crack the code of what is being shown on a cylinder seal. Like what were they trying to use the imagery for? What were they trying to tell us in the text? Well, not tell us, because I don't think they were made to necessarily tell the future what was happening, but to kind of understand more about people who created these objects and the people who owned these objects, the choices that were made in creating these objects, and then also what was being shown. So how much of it could have been religious, how much of it could have been political, how much of it was just human choice. I think this one looks pretty. These are the questions I would love to be able to crack. I would also absolutely love, if I was on excavation, I've gone on several excavations, to be able to find a cylinder seal workshop. That would be kind of the gem of all gems for me. Being able to find an in situ workshop with maybe cylinder seals in progress, the tools that were used, the layout of the space, how different things were collected, like the order of process, that would be a phenomenal discovery. And if I was the one who could be able to unearth one of these workshops, gosh, I don't think I would could ever top that achievement. But that one might be slightly harder.